In the heart of an endless desert, where the night sky was clear and the stars shimmered like diamonds, a group of 4 friends decided to spend a memorable night among the cold sands of the dunes. Their names were Alex, Sarah, David, and Leah. Each of them, with excitement and curiosity, packed their bags and set off towards a remote spot far from the city. Alex smiled and said, "I can't believe we're here. Look at this sky. The stars are infinite." David glanced around and responded, "Yeah, but I've heard that the desert can have strange sounds sometimes, especially at night." Sarah laughed and squeezed David's hand tightly. "Don't worry, we're all together." Leah, who had been quiet from the start, stared silently at the horizon. She had a strange feeling, as if something in the desert was waiting for them. Night fell, and the tents were set up. The flames of their campfire danced, casting an orange glow on the vast, endless sands. Each friend sat around the fire, listening to the crackling wood. A cold breeze blew from the desert, making the air feel heavy. David, while poking the fire with a stick, said, "I've heard there's a place in this desert. They say it's cursed. No one's ever been there, or if they have, they never came back." Sarah frowned and replied, "Cut it out, David. That's just an old story." Alex, however, had a serious look on his face, his eyes fixed on the dark horizon. Something had caught his attention, a shadow in the distance that quickly vanished. Leah, in a quiet voice, said, "Maybe that shadow is something that's following us. We shouldn't have come here." Alex's voice rose. "Leah, what are you talking about?" Without saying another word, Leah slowly stood up and walked into the darkness of the desert. Alex shouted, "Where are you going?" David quickly followed her, but his steps were heavy and slow on the dry sand. Suddenly, a scream echoed through the desert. Leah's voice, but it ended abruptly, as if swallowed by the night. Alex, Sarah, and David ran toward the spot where Leah had gone, but there was no trace of her. Only her footprints, which vanished as if they had never been there. Sarah, her voice trembling, said, This is impossible." "How?" David, breathing heavily, replied, "We have to go back. Right now." Alex, his voice shaking, said, "No, we can't leave without Leah." As the 3 remaining friends tried to figure out what to do, a strange sound emerged from the distance. A low, whispering voice, as if it came from beneath the sands. Sarah, her face pale, whispered, "What's that sound?" Alex strained to listen. The whispers were getting closer, coming from the very heart of the desert. Something had awakened in the dunes. Perhaps the same thing that had taken Leah. David screamed, "Let's go, now!" But before they could move, a shadow emerged from the darkness, rushing towards them at an impossible speed. Sarah, terrified, screamed and ran toward the tents, but before she could reach them, a shadow from behind caught her, and in the blink of an eye, she was gone. Alex and David stood frozen, their hearts racing. There was no way out. David, his voice trembling, whispered, "We were finished." Alex, barely audible, muttered, No, there has to be a way." But before Alex could make a move, another shadow came, sweeping David away. Now, Alex was alone. Terrified, he stood in place, looking around, but there was no one. Only the whispers, growing louder and louder, from every direction. In a soft voice, Alex muttered, "Leah, Sarah, David." And then, without a sound, the final shadow struck. The next morning, the desert was quiet and still. There was no sign of the four friends. Only the sands remained, and the wind. No one knew what had happened that night. But from that day forward, anyone who passed through the area could hear the whispers rising from the sands, telling the story of those four. Elisa and Mike, an adventurous couple always seeking new thrills, decided to spend their weekend in the heart of a remote desert. A place where the only sound was the soft whisper of the wind and the gentle rustling of sand. Although they knew there was no cell phone reception, they were certain the desert silence would provide the peace they needed. They set up their tent and waited for the sun to dip below the horizon. Elisa gazed at the horizon, where the sun was slowly sinking, and smiled. "This is perfect. No noise, no distractions." Mike nodded. "Yeah, this is exactly what we needed." Hours passed, and darkness fell. The flickering flames of their campfire were the only source of light in the vast, silent desert. Elisa, staring at the fire, said, "You know, sometimes I feel like there's something more to this silence." Mike chuckled. "What do you mean?" "The spirits of the sands." But there was a seriousness in Elisa's expression that made Mike pause. Elisa pulled out her phone, even though she knew there was no signal. She laughed. "I bet if there was an earthquake, no one would ever find out." Mike checked his own phone and said, "Yeah, no signal at all. That's what makes this place perfect to disconnect." Suddenly, Elisa's phone buzzed. She looked at the screen in disbelief. "Mike, look at this." Mike leaned over. On the screen, a strange message from an unknown number had appeared. It simply read, "Where are you?" Mike laughed. Weird. Maybe it picked up some signal for a second. Elisa was skeptical, but shrugged it off. It seemed harmless enough. They returned to chatting and watching the stars, but the message lingered in Elisa's mind. An hour later, Elisa checked her phone again. This time, another message had appeared. "You can't escape." Elisa, now genuinely concerned, turned to Mike. This isn't funny anymore." Mike, now also feeling uneasy, said, "It's got to be a prank. Maybe someone we know is messing with us using some app." But Elisa couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The wind picked up suddenly, and with it, a faint, eerie whisper. Mike tried to calm her. "Look, we're in the middle of nowhere. There's no one here to mess with us. Just put the phone down and come sit by the fire." Before Elisa could respond, another message appeared. "We're coming soon." Now even Mike was beginning to feel uneasy. There was no signal out here, yet the messages kept coming. Elisa, her voice trembling, asked, Who's coming? We're alone out here." Mike, trying to stay calm, grabbed his phone and walked toward the tent, hoping to catch some reception of his own. But there was nothing. No signal, no messages. At that moment, a strange sound echoed from the distance. It wasn't the wind. It was the sound of footsteps dragging across the sand. Mike rushed back to Elisa. "Listen, something's coming toward us." Elisa looked around frantically, but she couldn't see anything. Only the sound of the footsteps getting closer and closer. She glanced down at her phone just as another message appeared. "We're here." Mike grabbed a knife from his backpack. "We need to get out of here. Now!" But as they rushed to the tent to grab their things, Elisa's phone buzzed again. One last message. You can't run from us. Suddenly, a faint light appeared on the horizon. It was moving toward them, slowly and silently. Elisa clutched Mike's arm and whispered, "Oh, who are they?" Mike spoke quickly. "Maybe it's a car. We need to go." But no matter how fast they ran, the light kept getting closer. The footsteps were now right behind them. Elisa turned but saw no one, only the light and the endless sand. The wind howled louder, and with it came those eerie whispers. There was no doubt now, something more than human was toying with them. Mike, out of breath, yelled, "We need to hide." Elisa pointed toward the tent. They ran back and crawled inside, zipping it up quickly. Mike held the knife tightly in his hand, but the footsteps, they were right outside now. Elisa picked up her phone. One final message had appeared. "It's too late." At that moment, a scratching sound echoed from outside the tent. Something or someone was dragging their nails across the fabric. And then came the breathing, heavy, labored breaths, just inches away from where they sat. Mike's voice shaking whispered, What do we do?" Elisa didn't respond. She just stared at the fabric of the tent, heart pounding. Then, without warning, the tent tore open with a violent rip. The next morning, the desert was still and quiet. There was no sign of the tent, Elisa, or Mike. Only the sand remained, and Elisa's phone still displaying the last message. "We're coming soon." Jake had always loved solitude. A trip to the heart of the desert, completely alone, was his latest adventure. To him, the desert, with its endless silence and vast, open spaces, was the perfect escape from the noise of the city and the stress of everyday life. This time, he had chosen a place where no one would be, just the sound of the wind and the rustling of the sand. He pitched his tent and prepared for a peaceful night in the quiet desert. The sun slowly sank below the horizon, casting long, dark shadows across the dunes. Jake sat by his campfire, listening to the soft hum of the wind. Everything seemed perfect. Jake glanced around. Nothing but sand dunes stretched as far as the eye could see. But something felt off. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but it was as if something was watching him from a distance. He chuckled to himself. "You're just tired. You need some rest." Just then, he heard a soft rustling sound to his left. Turning his head, he saw a fox standing a few meters away, staring directly at him. The fox stood perfectly still, its eyes locked on Jake's. Jake smiled, whispering to himself, "Just a fox, nothing to worry about." But as he looked closer, he noticed the fox wasn't blinking. It stood unnaturally still, its eyes cold and lifeless, staring right through him. A bit unsettled, Jake stood up and tried to shake off the strange feeling. When he turned back to the fire, another rustling sound caught his attention. This time it came from behind him. He spun around and saw 3 wild cats, all sitting motionless, staring at him with the same dead gaze as the fox. There was something deeply unsettling about the way they were staring. Their eyes weren't just empty. They seemed devoid of life. Jake muttered under his breath, "Animals in the desert are different, I guess." But what was truly disturbing was the growing number of animals. Every time Jake glanced around, another one appeared. Now, a large snake slithered silently through the sand and stopped right in front of the fire. Its cold, dead eyes mirroring those of the other animals. Jake's breathing quickened. He was starting to feel like these animals were more than they appeared. It was as if something was using their bodies to watch him, something far beyond the natural world. Jake decided it was time to step away. He stood up and walked toward his tent, but with each step, he could feel eyes following him. When he reached his tent, the sound of chirping crickets suddenly stopped. An oppressive silence filled the air. Jake crawled into his tent and zipped it up tightly, but the silence of the desert was unnerving. There was no sound at all, except for the faint pounding of his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. Minutes passed, and then the faint rustling returned. Jake froze. He reached for his flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent. Shining the light outside, his heart nearly stopped. There, surrounding the campfire, were dozens of animals, foxes, cats, snakes, and more, all standing still, staring at him with those same soulless eyes. Jake quickly turned off the flashlight and zipped the tent back up. His heart pounded in his chest. What is going on? He whispered to himself. These animals weren't acting like any animals he'd ever seen. They weren't alive. They were just vessels for something else. The rustling outside grew louder, and now he could hear the heavy breathing of the animals just outside the tent. Jake knew he had to get out of there. He grabbed his knife and unzipped the tent, rushing outside. But the animals didn't move. They remained still, their lifeless eyes following his every movement. Jake's breathing was frantic now, but the animals still made no move to attack. They were simply waiting. Suddenly, a strange sound echoed from the distance. It wasn't the wind. It was a low, eerie whisper, like a voice carried on the breeze. Jake looked around in panic, but there was no one there. Just the animals and that haunting whisper that seemed to rise from the depths of the desert itself. Jake ran. He ran as fast as he could, but no matter how fast he moved, the feeling of being watched never left him. His breath grew ragged, and the ground beneath his feet seemed to shift like it was alive. When he stopped and turned around, the fox was right there, only a few feet behind him, its eyes locked on his. Jake raised his hand, holding the knife in a defensive stance, but the fox didn't attack. It just stood there, staring, its gaze cold and hollow. Jake didn't know what to do. But before he could make a decision, the whispers grew louder, surrounding him. It was as if the desert itself was speaking, and the animals, one by one, began to move toward him, slowly and deliberately. Jake's heart raced. There was no escape. He could feel it now. Something far more terrifying than any wild animal was at play. As the animals closed in, Jake understood this was no ordinary desert. It had a soul, a dark, ancient soul that had claimed him the moment he set foot in its sands. The next morning, the desert was silent once more. There was no trace of Jake or his camp. Only the footprints of animals remained, stretching across the dunes. And in the distance, carried on the wind, a faint whisper could still be heard, fading into the endless horizon. Sam had been searching for peace for what felt like an eternity. After weeks of relentless work at his company, he finally decided to spend a night alone in the heart of the desert. He loved the vast, open spaces where he could connect with nature and escape the pressures of daily life. But this time, something waited for him in the depths of the desert. something he could never have imagined. As night fell, Sam reached a remote spot far from civilization. The only thing surrounding him was endless dunes of sand under a starry sky. A gentle breeze moved the sand in waves, and the heat of the day still lingered in the air. He pitched his tent, lit a small fire, and settled in for what he thought would be a peaceful evening. At first, everything was calm. Sam sat by the fire, listening to the silence of the desert. But after a while, a faint sound reached his ears. It was the subtle movement of sand, not caused by the wind, but by something else. Sam looked up, scanning his surroundings. Nothing, just the endless dunes and the dark sky above. He shrugged it off, thinking it was just his mind playing tricks on him. Maybe the exhaustion from the trip was making him hear things. But then, the sound of shifting sand returned, louder and closer this time. Sam grabbed his flashlight and shone it across the desert. Still, nothing out of the ordinary. But then he noticed something strange. The sand itself wasn't still. The dunes, which should have been static, were moving in an unnatural way. It was as if the sand had a life of its own, rolling and twisting without the influence of the wind. Sam stood up and cautiously walked toward the nearest dune. The closer he got, the louder the sound of the shifting sand became. His heart began to race, but he convinced himself that there had to be a logical explanation. When he reached the top of the dune, his eyes widened. There, in the sand, were fresh footprints, human footprints, right in front of him. Sam took a step back, his breath catching in his throat. Where had these footprints come from? There was no one else here. He had been alone in this desert all day and hadn't seen a single soul. The shifting of the sand had stopped, leaving behind an oppressive silence. Sam quickly turned and made his way back to the camp. He could feel something watching him, but every time he glanced over his shoulder, nothing was there. Just him and the vast emptiness. Sitting back by the fire, he tried to calm his nerves. It's just your imagination. Deserts are always mysterious. You're overthinking it. But just as he tried to convince himself, he heard it. A faint whisper carried on the wind. The words were indistinguishable, barely audible, as if someone was speaking from a great distance. He strained to listen, but no one was there. It was just him, and perhaps something else. Sam was spooked, but he wasn't ready to give in to fear. He decided to crawl into his tent and sleep off the strange feelings. But as soon as he zipped up the tent and turned off the light, the sound of shifting sand returned. This time, it was louder and more frantic, like something was moving quickly beneath the surface. He grabbed his flashlight and unzipped the tent in a panic. What he saw made his blood run cold. The sand around his campfire was swirling violently, as if caught in a vortex. But there was no wind strong enough to cause it. And then, out of the swirling sand, something began to emerge. Faces. Pale, ghostly faces were rising from the sand. They had no eyes, only hollow sockets, and their mouths opened and closed in silent screams. Slowly, they rose higher, their expressionless faces locked onto Sam. He stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet, as more and more of them appeared, surrounding him. Sam's heart raced as he scrambled to his feet. He glanced in every direction, but there was nowhere to run. The ghostly figures rose from the dunes on all sides, inching closer and closer. He could hear their whispers now, soft and chilling like the desert itself was speaking through them. Panicked, Sam darted back into his tent. Zipping it shut, as if the thin fabric could protect him from the horrors outside. The sand continued to swirl, and the faces pressed closer, their whispers growing louder. "Come, come to us," they called, their voices now clear and unmistakable. Sam's hands trembled as he clutched his flashlight. He had to get out. He couldn't stay in the tent. With a surge of adrenaline, he unzipped the tent and sprinted toward his car. The faces followed, but they didn't move like living beings. They floated, gliding effortlessly across the sand, always watching him with their empty eyes. As Sam reached his car, he threw the door open and jumped inside. His hands shook as he fumbled with the keys, but the whispers followed him. They filled the car, surrounding him with their eerie call. "Stay with US," they chanted, their voices soft yet commanding. Finally, the engine roared to life, and Sam sped off into the night. The swirling sand and ghostly faces vanished in his rearview mirror, but the whispers stayed with him. Even when he reached the safety of the city, he could still hear them in the back of his mind, a reminder that the desert never forgets. The next day, there was no trace of Sam's camp. No footprints, no tent, nothing. Just the sand, stretching endlessly under the scorching sun. And in the distance, carried by the wind, the faint echo of whispers could still be heard, waiting for the next traveler to stumble into their grasp.